James Mitchell had been guarding the royal family for 12 years. He started as a young man fresh out of military service, eager to serve his country in a different way. Now at 34, he knew every corner of the palace, every routine, and every face that belonged within those ancient walls. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the West Wing as James walked his usual patrol route. His polished boots echoed softly on the marble floors, a sound he had grown to love over the years. The palace was waking up slowly, with staff members beginning their daily duties and the distant sound of kitchen preparations for the royal breakfast. James took pride in his work. He wasn't just any guard. He had earned the trust of the royal family through years of dedicated service. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestionable. The Queen herself had once complimented him on his attention to detail when he noticed a suspicious package. That turned out to be harmless but could have been dangerous. That particular morning felt different somehow. James couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an unusual tension in the air. Staff members seemed to whisper more quietly than usual, and some of the senior household members appeared nervous. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and they were telling him that something was not quite right. As he reached the corridor leading to Queen Camilla's private study, James noticed unusual activity. There were people coming and going who didn't normally have business in that area, some faces he didn't recognize at all, which was strange because he knew everyone who had regular access to the royal quarters. Queen Camilla had always been kind to the staff, including the security team. She remembered names, asked about families, and showed genuine interest in the people who worked to keep the royal household running smoothly. This made what James was beginning to suspect even more troubling. During his lunch break, James sat in the staff dining room and listened carefully to the conversations around him. The kitchen staff were talking in hushed tones about unusual requests for meetings and strange phone calls that came at odd hours. The housekeeping team mentioned that certain rooms were now off-limits without explanation. One of the senior maids, Mrs. Patterson, had been with the royal household for over 20 years. She was known for her discretion and professionalism, but even she seemed worried. When James asked her if everything was all right, she looked around nervously before saying that some things were happening that didn't feel right, but she couldn't say more. The afternoon brought more questions than answers. James noticed that Queen Camilla's usual schedule had been changed several times. Meetings that were supposed to happen in the main conference rooms were moved to more private locations. Visitors who normally would be announced and escorted through the main entrance were being brought in through side doors. As the day progressed, James found himself paying closer attention to details he might have normally overlooked. He noticed that certain documents were being carried in sealed envelopes rather than the usual official folders. Phone conversations were being conducted in hushed tones, and people would stop talking when he approached. The evening shift change brought James into contact with his colleague, Robert, who had been working the day shift in a different section of the palace. Robert mentioned that he had seen some government officials arrive earlier in the day, but they weren't on any official schedule that the security team had been informed about. This was highly unusual. The security team was always briefed about official visits, no matter how small or routine. The fact that government officials were in the palace without the proper security protocols being followed raised serious red flags for James. As his shift continued into the night, James found himself walking past Queen Camilla's study more frequently than usual. The lights were still on well past the time she normally retired for the evening. He could hear voices from inside, but the thick doors made it impossible to understand what was being discussed. Around midnight, James was stationed near the main entrance when he saw a man in an expensive suit leaving through a side exit. The man was carrying a briefcase and looked around nervously before getting into a car that was waiting with its engine running. This was not normal protocol for any legitimate palace business. James made a mental note of the car's license plate and the time of departure. His training had taught him to document anything unusual, even if it seemed insignificant at the time. He had a feeling that these details might become important later. The rest of his shift passed quietly, but James couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something significant. The combination of unusual visitors, changed schedules, nervous staff members, and secretive meetings all pointed to something happening behind the scenes. When his replacement arrived at dawn, James was ready to go home and try to make sense of what he had observed. But as he was leaving the palace, He overheard two senior staff members talking about a meeting that was scheduled for the next day. They mentioned that it was extremely important and that absolute secrecy was required. James drove home through the early morning streets of London, his mind racing with questions. In 12 years of service, he had never seen the palace operate with such secrecy, even during times of political tension or family crises. Whatever was happening involved Queen Camilla directly, and it was significant enough to require the highest levels of confidentiality. He knew that his duty was to protect the royal family, but he was beginning to wonder if protecting them might mean investigating what appeared to be happening right under everyone's noses. The trust that had been built over years of faithful service was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. As James pulled into his driveway, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out what was really going on, no matter what the consequences might be. The kingdom's trust in the royal family was sacred, and if that trust was being betrayed, someone needed to uncover the truth. The next evening, James returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent the day thinking about what he had observed, and he was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. His years of military training had taught him the importance of gathering intelligence before taking action. James decided to take a more systematic approach to his observations. He began keeping a small notebook hidden in his uniform pocket, where he could discreetly record times, dates, and details of anything unusual he witnessed. This wasn't something he had ever done before, but the circumstances seemed to require it. His first break came during the early hours of his shift. James was patrolling the east wing when he heard voices coming from a room that was supposed to be empty. The room was officially listed as being under renovation, but there had been no construction workers or equipment visible during the day. Moving closer to the door, James could make out at least 3 different voices. One belonged to Queen Camilla, which he recognized immediately. The other 2 were male voices that he didn't recognize, but they spoke with authority and confidence that suggested they held important positions. Through the slightly open door, James caught fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. They were discussing financial arrangements, transfers of money, and what sounded like payments for services rendered. The amounts being mentioned were staggering. Millions of pounds that seemed to be moving through unofficial channels. Queen Camilla's voice was clear as she discussed what she called necessary arrangements for securing certain outcomes. She mentioned several political figures by name and talked about influence that had been purchased and favors that were owed. The conversation made it sound like she was operating some kind of unofficial network that traded money for political influence. James carefully noted down everything he could remember from the conversation. The details were shocking, but he knew he needed more evidence before he could take any action. Making accusations against a member of the royal family based on overheard conversation fragments would be career suicide, and possibly worse. Over the next few nights, James began to notice patterns. The mysterious meetings always happened late at night or early in the morning, when most of the staff had gone home. The participants always used side entrances and seemed to avoid the main areas of the palace where they might be seen by regular staff members. James also noticed that certain areas of the palace had become restricted without any official announcement. Rooms that security guards normally had access to were suddenly off limits, and new electronic locks had been installed on doors that previously used traditional keys. The breakthrough came when James was asked to escort a delivery person to Queen Camilla's private office. The delivery was marked as urgent and confidential, which meant it had to be hand-delivered rather than left with the regular mail. As James waited outside the office while the delivery was made, he heard Queen Camilla on the phone discussing what sounded like the final details of a major transaction. She was talking about offshore accounts, untraceable payments, and ensuring that certain information would never become public. The conversation suggested that she was not just involved in financial improprieties, but was actively working to cover up activities that could cause serious damage to the monarchy if they were discovered. When the delivery person left, James lingered near the office and heard Queen Camilla make another phone call. This time she was speaking to someone she addressed as minister, and the conversation was about upcoming policy decisions that would benefit certain business interests. She mentioned specific companies and talked about ensuring favorable treatment in exchange for continued financial support. James realized that what he was witnessing was not just financial corruption, but a systematic abuse of royal influence for personal gain. Queen Camilla appeared to be using her position to create a network of political and business relationships that operated outside official channels and generated enormous sums of money. The implications were staggering. If what James was hearing was true, then Queen Camilla was betraying the fundamental principles of constitutional monarchy. The royal family was supposed to remain above politics and avoid any appearance of personal financial gain from their positions. What he was witnessing was a complete violation of those principles. James began to research the companies and political figures that Queen Camilla had mentioned in her conversations. Using his access to palace computers during quiet periods of his shift, he was able to find connections between these entities and recent government decisions that had benefited them financially. The pattern that emerged was clear and damning. Companies that had received favorable treatment from government regulators had connections to Queen Camilla through various intermediaries. Political figures who had championed certain policies had received substantial donations to their campaigns from organizations that could be traced back to the same network. As James dug deeper, he discovered that the corruption network was far more extensive than he had initially realized. It involved not just Queen Camilla, but several high-ranking government officials, business leaders, and even other members of the royal household staff. The scale of the operation was enormous, and the amount of money involved was in the hundreds of millions of pounds. The most shocking discovery came when James found evidence that some of the money being moved through this network was coming from foreign sources. There were payments from companies and individuals in countries that were not always friendly to British interests. This suggested that Queen Camilla might not just be engaged in domestic corruption, but could potentially be compromising national security. James found documents that had been carelessly left in a copying machine that showed bank account numbers, transfer amounts, and coded references to various transactions. He carefully photographed these documents with his personal phone, making sure not to be seen by any security cameras. The weight of what he had discovered was overwhelming. James had always prided himself on his loyalty to the crown, but now he was faced with evidence that a senior member of the royal family was engaged in activities that could destroy the monarchy's reputation and potentially harm the country's interests. As his shift ended that morning, James knew that he could no longer simply observe and gather information. The evidence he had collected was substantial, but he needed to decide what to do with it. The traditional chain of command would normally require him to report concerns to his superiors, but this situation involved people at the very top of the royal hierarchy. James drove home with copies of documents hidden in his jacket and a phone full of photographs that could change the course of British history. He had uncovered a betrayal that went to the very heart of the institution he had sworn to protect, and now he had to decide whether his loyalty was to the individuals involved or to the principles they were supposed to represent. The kingdom trusted the royal family to act with honor and integrity, but that trust was being systematically violated by someone who should have been its greatest guardian. James knew that exposing the truth would be dangerous, but he was beginning to realize that staying silent might be even worse. James spent his days off studying the evidence he had gathered, trying to understand the full scope of what he had uncovered. His small apartment was transformed into an investigation headquarters, with documents spread across his dining table and a timeline of events mapped out on his wall. The more James analyzed the information, the more disturbing the picture became. The corruption network wasn't just about money. It was about power and influence that reached into every level of government and business. Queen Camilla had somehow positioned herself at the center of a web that controlled decisions affecting millions of people. James discovered that several major government contracts had been awarded to companies that were part of this network. Infrastructure projects, defense contracts, and healthcare initiatives had all been influenced by the corrupt relationships that Queen Camilla had helped to create. The cost to taxpayers was enormous, but the profits for those involved were even greater. What made the situation even more troubling was the evidence that foreign governments were involved. James found records showing payments from companies controlled by countries that were considered strategic rivals of the United Kingdom. The money was being used to influence British policy in ways that could compromise national security and economic interests. James realized that he was not just dealing with corruption, but with what amounted to a form of treason. Queen Camilla was allowing foreign influence to shape British government decisions in exchange for personal financial gain. The betrayal of public trust was complete and devastating. The emotional impact of these discoveries was enormous for James. He had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family, believing that they represented the best values of the nation. Learning that one of the most senior members of that family was engaged in activities that undermined those very values left him feeling betrayed and confused. James tried to imagine how the public would react if they learned the truth. The monarchy had survived many scandals over the years, but this was different. This wasn't about personal behavior or family disputes. This was about the systematic abuse of constitutional power for criminal purposes. The evidence also revealed that the corruption had been going on for several years, possibly even before Queen Camilla had married into the royal family. This suggested that the activities were not just opportunistic, but were part of a deliberate long-term strategy to accumulate wealth and influence through the abuse of royal connections. James found records showing that some of the money generated by these corrupt activities was being hidden in offshore accounts and shell companies. The sophisticated financial structures suggested that professional advisors were involved, including lawyers, accountants, and investment managers who knew exactly what they were doing. As James continued his investigation, he began to understand that the corruption network extended beyond just financial crimes. There was evidence of blackmail and intimidation being used to maintain silence and cooperation. People who had tried to expose or investigate these activities had faced serious consequences, including job losses, legal problems, and even physical threats. This revelation made James realize the personal danger he was facing. If Queen Camilla and her associates were willing to use intimidation and worse to protect their secrets, then his own safety could be at risk. He was not just a guard anymore. He was someone who possessed information that could destroy powerful people. James decided that he needed to take steps to protect himself and the evidence he had gathered. He made multiple copies of all the documents and photographs, storing them in different locations, including a safety deposit box that he rented under a false name. He also prepared a detailed written account of everything he had discovered and witnessed. The psychological pressure was enormous. James found himself looking over his shoulder constantly, wondering if he was being watched or followed. He changed. His routines took different routes to and from work, and avoided using his phone or computer for anything related to his investigation. At work, James had to maintain his normal demeanor while continuing to gather information. This was becoming increasingly difficult, as the stress began to affect his sleep and concentration. He noticed that some of his colleagues were asking if he was feeling all right, which made him worry that his behavior was becoming noticeably different. During one particularly revealing night shift, James witnessed a meeting between Queen Camilla and a foreign diplomat who was not on any official visit schedule. The meeting took place in complete secrecy, with special arrangements made to ensure that no record of the diplomat's presence would exist in palace logs. James managed to position himself where he could observe the meeting through a partially open door. He saw Queen Camilla receive a briefcase from the diplomat and heard them discuss arrangements for future policy decisions that would benefit the diplomat's country. The conversation made it clear that this was an established relationship with regular exchanges of money for influence. The foreign diplomat mentioned specific upcoming parliamentary votes and government decisions that would be influenced by Queen Camilla's network. The level of detail in their discussion showed that the corruption had penetrated deep into the machinery of government, affecting everything from trade policies to security arrangements. James photographed the diplomat as he left the palace and later used facial recognition software to identify him as a senior intelligence officer from a country that was known for its aggressive approach to international espionage. This confirmed his worst fears about the national security implications of what he had discovered. The next day, James noticed unusual activity around his own work assignments. He was suddenly given different patrol routes and schedules, which suggested that someone might be trying to limit his access to certain areas of the palace. This could have been a coincidence, but given what he knew about the intimidation tactics used by the corruption network, he suspected that his investigations might have been detected. James realized that he was running out of time. If the network was becoming aware of his activities, then he needed to act quickly before they could take steps to silence him or destroy evidence. The investigation phase was coming to an end, and he needed to decide how to expose what he had learned. The moral dimension of his situation was clear to James. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown, but the crown was being dishonored by one of its own members. His duty was not to protect individuals who were betraying everything the monarchy was supposed to represent, but to protect the institution itself by exposing those who were corrupting it. James began to research his options for revealing the truth. He could try to work within the palace hierarchy, but the evidence suggested that other senior staff members might be involved or compromised. He could approach law enforcement, but the corruption reached into government circles that might include people with influence over police and prosecutors. The media represented another option, but James knew that accusations against the royal family required extraordinary evidence and careful handling. He would need to find journalists who were both credible and brave enough to investigate and publish such explosive material. As his next shift approached, James knew that he was approaching a point of no return. The evidence he had gathered was overwhelming, but using it would mean the end of his career and possibly much more. He was about to become the person who exposed the most damaging royal scandal in modern British history. James knew that his next few shifts would be critical. He needed to gather the final pieces of evidence that would make his case irrefutable, but he also had to be extremely careful not to raise suspicions. The changed patrol routes and schedules suggested that someone was already watching him more closely than usual. On his first night back at work, James noticed that a new security camera had been installed in a corridor where he had previously observed some of the secret meetings. This was not a coincidence. Someone was taking steps to monitor activities in areas that had previously been less supervised. James realized that the corruption network was becoming more cautious, possibly because they suspected that their activities were being observed. Despite the increased surveillance, James was determined to obtain the evidence he needed. He had learned that Queen Camilla was scheduled to meet with a group of business leaders the following week, and he suspected that this meeting would involve significant financial arrangements. If he could document this meeting properly, it would provide the final proof he needed. James used his access to the palace scheduling system to learn more about the upcoming meeting. The official records showed only a brief notation about a private consultation, but James knew from his previous observations that these vague descriptions usually meant something much more significant was happening. Through careful observation of staff preparations, James learned that the meeting would take place in Queen Camilla's private conference room and would involve at least 6 participants in addition to the Queen herself. Special catering arrangements had been made, and extra security measures were being put in place to ensure complete privacy. James also discovered that electronic devices would be collected at the beginning of the meeting to prevent any recordings or communications. This level of secrecy was unprecedented, even for sensitive royal business, and confirmed that whatever was being discussed required absolute confidentiality. The preparation for the meeting provided James with opportunities to gather additional evidence. He was able to access delivery receipts that showed expensive gifts being brought to the palace for distribution to the meeting participants. The gifts included luxury watches, jewelry, and other valuable items that seemed designed to cement business relationships. James found financial documents that had been prepared for the meeting, including spreadsheets showing profit projections and investment returns. The numbers were staggering. The business ventures being discussed would generate hundreds of millions of pounds in profits over the next few years. The documents made it clear that Queen Camilla would receive substantial payments in exchange for her assistance in securing government approvals and favorable regulations. The most damning evidence came when James discovered a draft agreement that outlined the specific services Queen Camilla would provide in exchange for payments. The document included detailed descriptions of her influence over government officials, her ability to arrange private meetings with ministers, and her capacity to ensure that certain information would remain confidential. The agreement also revealed that Queen Camilla had been providing inside information about government policies and decisions to her business partners. This information had been used to make investment decisions and secure competitive advantages that had resulted in enormous profits. The betrayal of government confidentiality was a serious crime that could result in charges of treason. James photographed all of these documents, but he knew that he needed more than just paperwork to make his case completely convincing. He needed audio or video evidence of Queen Camilla actually engaging in corrupt activities. This would require him to take enormous risks, but he felt that the stakes were too high to settle for incomplete evidence. Using his knowledge of the palace's layout and security systems, James identified a location where he could potentially record the upcoming meeting without being detected. There was a maintenance room adjacent to Queen Camilla's conference room that shared a ventilation system. If he could position a recording device in the right location, he might be able to capture audio of the entire meeting. James purchased a small, high-quality recording device that could operate for several hours without being detected. He tested the device at home to ensure that it would capture clear audio even through walls and ventilation systems. The recording quality was excellent, and the device was small enough to be hidden easily. The night before the scheduled meeting, James used his maintenance access to position the recording device in the ventilation system. The work required him to access areas of the palace that were normally off-limits to security guards, but his years of service had given him knowledge of override codes and emergency procedures that allowed him to move through restricted areas. As James placed the recording device, he was discovered by another security guard who was conducting an unexpected patrol. James had to think quickly to explain his presence in the restricted area. He claimed that he had been investigating unusual sounds that might indicate a mechanical problem with the ventilation system. The other guard seemed suspicious, but accepted James's explanation. However, James knew that the incident would be reported and might lead to questions about his activities. He realized that he was running out of time and would need to retrieve the evidence and take action immediately after the meeting concluded. The day of the meeting, James maintained his normal work routine while internally preparing for what might be his final shift as a royal guard. He had prepared detailed copies of all his evidence and had written a comprehensive account of everything he had discovered. If something happened to him, he wanted to ensure that the truth would still come to light. As the meeting participants began arriving at the palace, James observed them from his assigned post. He recognized several faces from business magazines and news reports. These were some of the most powerful corporate leaders in the country. Their presence at a secret meeting with Queen Camilla confirmed the enormous scope of the corruption network. The meeting lasted for over 3 hours, during which James could occasionally hear voices through the ventilation system. He knew that his recording device was capturing everything, but he couldn't help feeling anxious about whether the audio quality would be sufficient to understand the conversations clearly. When the meeting finally ended, James watched as the participants left through different exits to avoid being seen together. They carried briefcases and packages that had not been present when they arrived, suggesting that documents and possibly payments had been exchanged during the meeting. After all the participants had left and the area was clear, James retrieved his recording device from the ventilation system. His hands were shaking as he handled the small device that contained what might be the most explosive political evidence in British history. James quickly returned to his assigned post and completed his shift without incident. But as he prepared to leave the palace that morning, he was approached by his supervisor, who informed him that there would be a security review of all guard activities from the previous night. James realized that his time was up. He needed to act immediately before the review discovered his unauthorized activities. As James drove home with the recording device in his pocket, he knew that he had reached the point of no return. The evidence he possessed was complete and devastating, but using it would mean the end of his career and the beginning of a battle against some of the most powerful people in the country. The weight of responsibility was enormous. James held information that would shock the nation and potentially change the course of British history. The trust that millions of people placed in the royal family was about to be shattered by revelations that one of its senior members had betrayed everything the monarchy claimed to represent. James spent the remainder of the day listening to the recording and transcribing the most important conversations. What he heard confirmed his worst fears and provided evidence of crimes that went far beyond anything he had previously suspected. The kingdom was about to learn that its trust had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. James sat in his apartment listening to the recording for the 3rd time, and each replay made the conversations more shocking than the last. Queen Camilla's voice was clear as she discussed specific amounts of money, named government officials who were being influenced, and outlined plans for future corrupt activities that would generate even more illegal profits. The recording captured Queen Camilla explicitly, agreeing to use her royal influence to ensure that certain business deals would receive government approval. She discussed her ability to arrange private meetings with cabinet ministers and promised to share confidential information about upcoming policy changes that would affect financial markets. Most damaging of all, the recording revealed that Queen Camilla had been receiving regular payments from foreign governments in exchange for influencing British foreign policy decisions. She discussed specific diplomatic positions that the United Kingdom would take in international negotiations, making it clear that British national interests were being compromised for personal financial gain. James transcribed the most incriminating portions of the conversation, creating a document that laid out the evidence in clear, undeniable terms. The transcript showed systematic corruption that had been ongoing for years and involved millions of pounds in illegal payments and benefits. The decision about what to do with this evidence was the most difficult of James's life. He had spent 12 years protecting the royal family, and now he was about to expose one of its senior members as a criminal. But James realized that his ultimate loyalty was not to individuals, but to the principles and institutions that the monarchy was supposed to represent. James decided that he needed to approach multiple authorities simultaneously to ensure that the evidence could not be suppressed or destroyed. He would contact law enforcement, parliamentary investigators, and the media at the same time, making it impossible for the corruption network to prevent the truth from coming to light. His first step was to prepare comprehensive evidence packages that included copies of all the documents he had photographed, transcripts of the recorded conversations, and a detailed written account of everything he had witnessed. James created multiple copies of these packages and stored them in different secure locations. James then began researching which specific individuals and organizations he should contact. He identified several senior police investigators who specialized in corruption cases, parliamentary committee members who had jurisdiction over royal matters, and investigative journalists who had experience with sensitive political stories. The legal implications for James himself were serious. By recording conversations without permission and accessing restricted areas of the palace, he had technically broken several laws. However, he believed that the public interest in exposing massive corruption would outweigh the minor infractions he had committed in gathering the evidence. James also knew that he would face intense scrutiny and probably retaliation from powerful people who would be damaged by his revelations. He prepared for the possibility that he might lose his job, face legal challenges, and even encounter personal threats. But he felt that the consequences of remaining silent would be far worse than the risks of speaking out. On a Tuesday morning that would change British history, James made his first contact with authorities. He called Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Williams, who led the Metropolitan Police's Corruption Investigation Unit. James arranged to meet with her that afternoon, explaining only that he had evidence of serious crimes involving government officials. During the meeting with Detective Inspector Williams, James presented his evidence carefully and methodically. He started with the financial documents and photographs, then played selected portions of the audio recording. The detective's expression changed from skepticism to shock to grim determination as she realized the scope of what James had uncovered. Detective Inspector Williams immediately recognized that the evidence was both authentic and explosive. She arranged for James to be placed in protective custody while the investigation began, understanding that his safety might be at risk once word of his revelations began to spread. James's next contact was with Sir Michael Thompson, the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Constitutional Affairs. Sir Michael had a reputation for integrity and independence that made him the ideal person to handle such sensitive material. When James explained that he had evidence of royal involvement in serious crimes, Sir Michael agreed to meet with him immediately. The meeting with Sir Michael took place in a secure government facility where James presented the same evidence he had shown to the police. Sir Michael was visibly shaken by the revelations, particularly the evidence of foreign influence over British policy decisions. He assured James that the Parliamentary Committee would launch a full investigation and that the evidence would be protected from any attempts at suppression. James's final contact was with Victoria Patterson, an investigative journalist for a major national newspaper who had won awards for her exposure of government corruption. Victoria had a reputation for careful fact-checking and fearless reporting, making her the ideal person to bring the story to public attention. The meeting with Victoria took place in a private location where James could present his evidence without being observed. Victoria listened carefully to the audio recordings and examined the documents with the practiced eye of an experienced investigative reporter. She immediately understood the historical significance of what James had discovered. Victoria explained that publishing such explosive allegations about the royal family would require extensive legal review and additional verification of the evidence. However, she assured James that her newspaper was committed to exposing corruption at any level of society, and that the story would be published once all necessary precautions had been taken. Within hours of James's meetings with authorities and the media, word began to spread through government and palace circles that explosive evidence had been discovered. James received a phone call from his supervisor, ordering him to report to the palace immediately for an emergency meeting. James knew that returning to the palace might be dangerous, but he also realized that he could not avoid the confrontation forever. He arranged for Detective Inspector Williams to accompany him to the meeting, ensuring that any threats or intimidation attempts would be witnessed by law enforcement. The meeting at the palace was tense and hostile. James was confronted by senior palace officials who demanded to know what evidence he had gathered and who he had shared it with. When James refused to reveal details about his investigation, he was immediately suspended from his position and ordered to surrender his security credentials. The palace officials made it clear that James would face serious legal consequences for his unauthorized activities, but Detective Inspector Williams informed them that James was now under police protection as a key witness in a major criminal investigation. The officials were forced to allow James to leave without further interference. As news of the investigation began to leak through government circles, James received phone calls from lawyers representing various powerful individuals who had been named in his evidence. The lawyers attempted to discredit James and threaten legal action, but James referred all communications to the authorities who were now handling the case. The pressure on James was enormous, but he felt a sense of relief that the truth was finally being revealed. After weeks of carrying the burden of knowledge about massive corruption, he was no longer alone in possessing information that could change the course of British history. Victoria Patterson worked through the night with her editorial team to prepare the story for publication. The newspaper's lawyers reviewed every detail of the evidence to ensure that the reporting was accurate and legally sound. By dawn, the first edition was ready to print with headlines that would shock the nation. As James tried to sleep in the police safe house where he was being protected, he knew that when he woke up, the world would be a different place. The kingdom that had trusted Queen Camilla to represent their highest values was about to learn that their trust had been betrayed in the most devastating way possible. The story that would dominate headlines around the world was about to break, and James Mitchell, a simple palace guard who had sworn to protect the crown, had become the man who exposed the greatest royal scandal in modern British history. The morning sun had barely risen when the first copies of the newspaper hit the streets of London. The headline dominated the entire front page in bold letters. Royal Betrayal, Queen Camilla, exposed in massive corruption scandal. Below the headline was a photograph of official documents and a detailed account of the evidence that James had gathered. Within minutes of the newspaper's release, the story was spreading across social media platforms faster than anyone could have imagined. Videos of people reading the newspaper with shocked expressions began appearing online, and the hashtag #RoyalBetrayal started trending worldwide before most people had finished their morning coffee. James watched the news coverage from his police protection location, seeing his months of careful investigation transform into a national crisis. Television news channels interrupted their regular programming to report on the scandal, with political experts and constitutional scholars being rushed into studios to discuss the implications. The immediate reaction from Buckingham Palace was a brief statement, denying all allegations and promising a full investigation. However, the palace's response seemed weak and defensive compared to the overwhelming evidence that was being presented to the public. Royal officials who were contacted by reporters either refused to comment or claimed they had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. By midday, protests had begun forming outside Buckingham Palace. Citizens who felt betrayed by the revelations gathered with signs demanding answers and accountability. The crowd grew throughout the day as more people learned about the scandal and came to express their outrage at the betrayal of public trust. Parliament was forced into an emergency session as members of both major political parties demanded immediate action. The Prime Minister, who was reportedly caught completely off guard by the revelations, announced that the government would cooperate fully with all investigations and that anyone found guilty of wrongdoing would face the full consequences of the law. Opposition leaders called for the immediate suspension of Queen Camilla from all royal duties, pending the outcome of the investigation. Some of the more radical voices even suggested that the entire monarchy should be abolished if it could not maintain basic standards of integrity and honesty. The financial markets reacted with panic as investors tried to understand the implications of the scandal for British political stability. The pound dropped sharply against other major currencies, and stock prices fell as uncertainty about the government's future created widespread anxiety among business leaders. International media picked up the story within hours, with news organizations around the world featuring the scandal as their lead story. Foreign governments that had diplomatic relationships with Britain began privately questioning whether they could trust any agreements or commitments made by officials who might have been influenced by Queen Camilla's corruption network. James received dozens of phone calls from reporters wanting to interview him, but his police protection team advised him to avoid all media contact until the formal investigations were complete. The attention was overwhelming, and James realized that his life would never be the same regardless of how the scandal ultimately resolved. The business leaders, who had been identified in James's evidence, began hiring expensive legal teams and public relations firms to manage the crisis. Several of them issued statements claiming that they had no knowledge of any illegal activities and had only engaged in legitimate business discussions with royal representatives. However, the audio recordings that James had made were being analyzed by forensic experts who confirmed their authenticity. The voices of Queen Camilla and her associates were clearly identifiable, and the content of their conversations left no doubt about their criminal intentions and activities. By evening, additional evidence was emerging as other people came forward with information about suspicious activities they had witnessed. Palace staff members who had been afraid to speak out previously now felt empowered to share their observations with investigators. The corruption network was being exposed from multiple directions simultaneously. Queen Camilla herself remained silent throughout the first day of the crisis, reportedly meeting with lawyers and advisors behind closed doors at one of the royal estates. Her absence from public view only fueled more speculation about her guilt and the extent of her involvement in the corruption network. The Archbishop of Canterbury, as the senior religious leader in Britain, issued a statement expressing deep concern about the allegations and calling for truth and accountability to prevail. Religious leaders from other faiths joined in expressing their disappointment at the apparent betrayal of the moral standards that the royal family was expected to uphold. Legal experts appearing on television explained the potential charges that Queen Camilla could face if the allegations were proven true. These included bribery, corruption, money laundering, and potentially treason for accepting payments from foreign governments. The penalties for such crimes could include substantial prison sentences and the complete loss of royal titles and privileges. The scandal also raised serious questions about the security and oversight procedures within the royal household. How had such extensive criminal activities gone undetected for so long? Were there other members of the royal family or senior staff who knew about the corruption but failed to report it? James's role in exposing the scandal made him both a hero and a target. Supporters praised his courage in speaking truth to power and protecting the integrity of British institutions. Critics questioned his methods and suggested that his actions were motivated by personal grievance rather than public service. Detective Inspector Williams held a press conference announcing that multiple arrests were expected within the coming days as the investigation expanded. She confirmed that the evidence provided by James Mitchell was substantial and credible, and that additional resources were being allocated to investigate all aspects of the corruption. Network social media platforms struggled to manage the overwhelming volume of posts and comments about the scandal. Trending topics related to the royal family dominated global discussions, with opinions ranging from calls for immediate abolition of the monarchy to demands for reform and accountability. Measures. International allies of Britain began privately expressing concerns about the stability of the British government and the reliability of future diplomatic commitments. The scandal was not just a domestic crisis, but a threat to Britain's international reputation and influence. As the first day of the scandal drew to a close, it was clear that the revelations had created a crisis that would reshape British politics and society for years to come. The trust that had been built over generations between the royal family and the British people had been shattered in a single day. James fell asleep that night knowing that he had changed the course of history. His decision to expose the truth had created chaos and uncertainty, but it had also protected the fundamental principle that no one, regardless of their position or title, should be above the law. The kingdom that had gone to sleep the previous night trusting in the integrity of their royal family had awakened to discover that their trust had been systematically betrayed. The full consequences of that betrayal were only beginning to unfold, but already it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, more arrests, and deeper questions about the future of the monarchy itself. But tonight the truth was finally out, and the people of Britain were beginning to understand the magnitude of the betrayal that had been committed in their name. 3 months after James Mitchell's revelations shocked the world, the full scope of the royal corruption scandal had been revealed through extensive investigations by police, parliamentary committees, and international authorities. The evidence James had gathered proved to be just the beginning of a corruption network that was far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. Queen Camilla had been formally charged with multiple serious crimes, including bribery, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud, and violations of the Official Secrets Act. The charges were based on overwhelming evidence that included not only James's recordings and documents, but also additional evidence discovered during raids on properties and bank accounts across several countries. The legal proceedings against Queen Camilla became the most closely watched trial in modern British history. The evidence presented in court revealed that she had received over £50 million in illegal payments over a period of 6 years, money that had been hidden in complex offshore financial structures designed to avoid detection by authorities. The trial also revealed the names of dozens of government officials, business leaders, and foreign agents who had been part of the corruption network. Many of these individuals were arrested and charged with their own crimes, creating a cascade of legal proceedings that would continue for years to come. James testified as the key witness in the trial, describing how he had gradually uncovered the evidence of systematic corruption within the royal household. His testimony was compelling and detailed, and the defense lawyers were unable to challenge the authenticity of the evidence he had gathered or question his motives for exposing the truth. The impact on the royal family was devastating but also transformative. King Charles was forced to strip Queen Camilla of all royal titles and remove her from the line of succession. In an unprecedented move, he also announced major reforms to royal oversight and transparency measures designed to prevent such corruption from ever happening again. The monarchy survived the scandal, but it was forever changed. New laws were passed requiring detailed financial disclosure by all members of the royal family, independent oversight of royal activities, and regular audits of royal household operations. The British people demanded accountability, and the royal family was forced to accept unprecedented limitations on their traditional privacy and autonomy. Parliament passed the Royal Accountability Act, which created permanent oversight mechanisms and gave investigators greater access to royal activities. The legislation was supported by overwhelming majorities in both houses of Parliament and represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the monarchy and democratic institutions. James Mitchell became a reluctant public figure, praised by many as a hero who had protected British democracy, but also criticized by those who felt he had betrayed his oath of loyalty to the royal family. He received death threats from supporters of Queen Camilla, but also received honors and recognition from organizations dedicated to fighting corruption and protecting whistleblowers. The financial impact of the scandal was enormous. The companies that had benefited from corrupt government decisions were forced to pay massive fines and penalties. Several major business leaders were imprisoned, and their companies faced years of regulatory scrutiny and legal challenges. International relationships were also affected as foreign governments that had been involved in corrupting British officials faced diplomatic consequences. Several trade agreements were renegotiated, and intelligence sharing arrangements were reviewed to prevent future foreign interference in British domestic affairs. Queen Camilla was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in prison after being convicted on all charges. The judge noted that her betrayal of public trust had been systematic and deliberate, and that the damage to British institutions and international relationships was severe and long-lasting. The trial and conviction sent a powerful message that no one, regardless of their position or status, was above the law. The principle of equality before justice had been upheld, even when it meant prosecuting one of the most senior members of the royal family. James was offered a substantial financial reward for his role in exposing the corruption, but he declined most of the money and instead donated it to charities that supported transparency in government and protection for whistleblowers. He wanted to make it clear that his actions had been motivated by principle rather than personal gain. 2 years after the scandal broke, James published a book about his experiences, titled Duty and Truth: A Guard's Journey. The book became a bestseller and helped establish him as a respected voice on issues of integrity and accountability in public service. He used the platform to advocate for stronger protection for people who expose wrongdoing in government and business. The reforms implemented as a result of the scandal had lasting effects on British government and society. Public confidence in institutions was initially damaged by the revelations, but gradually recovered as people saw that the system was capable of holding powerful individuals accountable for their actions. Educational programs were established to teach young people about the importance of ethical behavior in public service and the role that ordinary citizens can play in protecting democratic institutions. James often spoke to these groups, sharing his experience and encouraging others to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. The corruption network that Queen Camilla had led was completely dismantled, with its members facing justice and its financial assets seized by authorities. The money that was recovered was used to compensate taxpayers for the damage caused by corrupt government decisions and to fund new oversight and transparency initiatives. James returned to security work, but in a different capacity. He became a consultant helping organizations identify and prevent corruption risks. His experience had given him unique insights into how corruption networks operate and how they can be detected and exposed before they cause serious damage. The palace where James had worked for 12 years was transformed by the reforms that followed the scandal. New security procedures, financial controls, and oversight mechanisms were implemented to ensure that no future corruption could go undetected. The changes were dramatic but necessary to restore public confidence in the institution. 5 years after exposing the scandal, James reflected on the consequences of his actions during a television interview. He acknowledged that the decision to reveal the truth had been difficult and that the consequences had been more far-reaching than he had ever imagined. However, he remained convinced that staying silent would have been far worse than speaking out. The kingdom that had been shaken by the revelation of Queen Camilla's betrayal had emerged stronger and more vigilant. The institutions of democracy had proven their resilience by holding even the most powerful individuals accountable for their actions. The rule of law had been upheld, and public trust had been gradually restored through transparency and reform. James Mitchell, the palace guard who had sworn to protect the crown, had ultimately protected something far more important: the principle that truth and justice must prevail regardless of the personal cost. His courage in exposing corruption had not only brought criminals to justice but had also strengthened the foundations of British democracy. For future generations, the scandal would be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in modern royal history, but also as a turning point that demonstrated the strength of British institutions and the power of individual conscience to protect the public interest. James's action had left the kingdom not speechless with shock, but speaking with a stronger voice about the values that truly mattered in a democratic society.